So, folks, we have JFK news, JFK assassination news. Now, here's the thing about the Kennedy assassination. It seems like it's the conspiratorial position to say that he probably wasn't killed by a lone gunman.
Mm-hmm. The thing that the government wants you to believe is the conspiratorial position at this point.
So yeah, and like books have come out. Vincent Bugliosi has one. Gerald Posner has one called Case Closed, saying it was definitely Oswald, and he definitely didn't have any connections. The thing about that interpretation of the Kennedy assassination is that it's for babies. It's for babies who don't want to actually confront reality. So we have two clips of Jefferson Morley from C-SPAN. Jefferson Morley is a great, there's so many really good historians in the JFK assassination stuff. And he's talking about a recent release and retention of certain documents regarding to the JFK assassination. What's interesting about JFK assassination release of documents is that I'm not a huge fan of the Oliver Stone JFK assassination movie that came out in the 90s as a work of art itself. I think there's some weird emphases.
Right.
And I as a person who totally believes Kennedy was whacked by domestic enemies, I'm not a huge fan of that movie.
Well, unfortunately, Oliver Stone wasn't able to make a movie after that came out, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. We'll gloss over that. But that movie was actually met with a lot of action from the government because they realized, oh, there's a lot of energy here. People want to know this stuff. And actually, like, there was a Records Act, a Freedom of Information sort of style Records Act passed in the wake of that film that really informs our ability to understand what intelligence community particularly was doing at that time. And so let's just play this first clip from Jefferson Morley on C-SPAN. And Morley, I will say, like, again, like the lone gunman whack job thing, that's for babies. That's not tenable with what we know since these records have been released. And let's play Morley, and I'll get into that a little bit more.
What we've learned since the 1990s is the official story that one man came along and killed the president, and another guy came along and killed that man, and there was nothing to it. There was no politics involved. That explanation, never particularly credible, has gotten less credible over time. And a couple of things that we've learned since the mid-1990s from the new records, really stand out. One, the story that this man, Lee Harvey Oswald, kind of came out of nowhere and we didn't know anything about him, that's nonsense. The CIA knew all about Lee Harvey Oswald. They had been following him for 4 years. They'd monitored all of his actions. Every piece of paper in the federal government, from the FBI, the State Department, the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Marine Corps, which Oswald was in, all of the information about Oswald went to one place in the CIA, the counterintelligence staff, run by James Angleton. And I talk about this in my book, The Ghost. So the idea that this guy came out of nowhere and shot the president, that's the official story. It's simply not true. I mean, let's say Oswald shot the president. I'm not sure he did, but let's say he did. The fact remains that we now know top CIA officials, very senior undercover operations officers, were fully informed about Lee Harvey Oswald's movements, his personal life, his political beliefs, and even his contacts with presumed foreign intelligence agents were known to top CIA officers 6 weeks before Kennedy was killed. And then, when Kennedy was killed and Oswald was arrested for the crime, the CIA pretended that they didn't know anything about him. And that pretense, we didn't really know anything about this guy, we now know that that was a lie, and it was a lie from the start. And that lying has continued to this day. So really what we learned from the release last week is they're still holding back the whole story.
We have calls line.
Now, a couple things to note on that. Holding back the whole story, because when the JFK Records Act was passed in 1992, they gave it 25 years to retain certain documents. Fast forward 25 years later, guess who's president? Oh, Mr. Trump, look at me. I'm the deep state's worst enemy. It's time to get these guys. The CIA hate those guys, really hate them. Mike Pompeo comes to the Oval Office and says, hey, we can't release this stuff. Okay, I won't release it. So it's not released. And a lot of the stuff, including tape between historian William Manchester and Jackie Kennedy, won't be released until 2039. But I want to get my Jordan Peterson on a little bit here and talk about mythology and how we interpret like big historic events. So Hitler, what is the story when we see Hitler, when the images of Hitler are all in front of a huge crowd of people? It is basically an anti-populist message,
yes.
right? Like Hitler got...
it's not his fascist ideology. It's not his far right-wing ideology. It's not his racist ideology.
It's not his collaboration with capitalists and state elites.
Yes.
It's the people.
Right.
And like we know, like Hitler was constantly courting like area capitalists because I'm the only one that can save you from Marxism. But if you make it like the people demanded basically almost that Hitler do this or went along with him, it's an anti-populist message, basically. The JFK assassination is the exact same thing. When you believe that it's just some lone whack job, right? And this is where you can get gun rights, people who think that you should have a right to bear arms. In the wake of the Kennedy assassination, we really restricted those rights a lot. And it was because of this anti-person thing, rather than looking into these connections of Oswald with, as I think, transparently an intelligence asset. Like his history of going from bases, the U-2 spy plane bases in Japan, or doing weird sort of Cuba stuff, fair play for Cuba stuff in New Orleans, that seems a bit odd. Like in my opinion, he's just definitely an intelligence
the ease of
asset.
his also eventual killing,
and what we know about the CIA and just the documentation they had of him, and they were keeping track of his stuff. So instead of a whack job, out there that we can't trust, this is actually another elite conspiracy, and that needs, if not like,
and an actual elite conspiracy.
That's the way to look at it, right?
Yeah.
And like, and we talk about conspiracies, and I think certain conspiracies we warn against because they are disempowering. I do not think this conspiracy is at all. I think it's actually very empowering. Particularly, you look at what the JFK movie brought about with this Records Act. This helps us understand our intelligence community in a way that really threatens them to the point where they keep burying stuff. So I want to play this second clip where if you don't take my word for it, let's see some other people who might have thought that they didn't trust the official, I would say, baby narrative.
The explanation that Oswald was acting alone, why didn't he shoot earlier? A very good question. Jackie Kennedy's position during the assassination, she's the closest eyewitness to what happened, right? Now, Jackie Kennedy never believed the official story that one man alone killed her president. She did not believe that. She believed that the president was killed by his domestic enemies. And she and Bobby Kennedy conveyed that message. We now know, this is one of the things we've learned since the 1990s. Jackie Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy told a friend who was going to the Soviet Union in 1963 after the president was killed, and they gave him a message, and they said, here's a message for the leaders of the Soviet Union. There's talk about Oswald was a communist. We don't put any stock in that. We believe that the president was killed by his domestic enemies. And Bobby Kennedy said, I'm going to run for president, and if I regain the presidency, I'm going to continue my brother's policies towards the Soviet Union. So Jackie and Bobby send a very friendly message to the Soviet government, saying we don't buy this business about Oswald being a communist or the president was killed by a communist. We believe he was killed by domestic enemies. That was a very strong belief that they held. Bobby Kennedy held that belief for the rest of his life.
And of course, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated probably by the same domestic enemies when he was running for president. I think it's fairly obvious that
I haven't heard anything about that.
So unlike the Dealey Plaza JFK stuff where I don't know, like maybe Oswald was a shooter, like that ballistics sort of get into the minutia of the ballistics. I think that's like, it's not very fruitful. It's way more interesting to look at the connections of like Angleton and what they knew when they knew it. But the RFK assassination, I haven't looked at that as much as the JFK one, but there's not a whole lot to look into. It's just kind of unexplainable,
right? And and sloppier.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, in my opinion, because of this. And I have two other recommendations before I head off here.
No, I have a question though.
Yes.
Unless you want to give the recommendations first.
No, go for it.
Okay, so I'm pretty green to the JFK assassination stuff, but I trust your judgment immensely. the FBI involvement in that Malcolm X's assassination is now documented. It is a matter of fact. So you can't you can't disprove that. That came out maybe a year or two ago, or actually maybe earlier this year.
Yeah.
MLK, it's clear that they either were hands off or that they were involved in assassinating him. I think that's quite obvious.
And documentedly encouraged him to kill himself.
Yes, and we knew that and blackmailed him.
Yep.
Fred Hampton, they didn't even bother hiding it.
Yep.
When it comes to JFK, what are the... he was, yes, reluctant in the Bay of Pigs, but he still was eager, or at least willing to go along with what the deep state was trying to do, the deep state. So what would be the motive in this area?
So the Bay of Pigs thing is an interesting thing. So Bay of Pigs planned when Eisenhower and Nixon were in office. Eisenhower had a bad heart. Nixon was basically taking point on the Bay of Pigs. That election in 1960 was very, very close. And it is true that people point out, like, well, JFK ran to the right of Nixon in that. Well, you know, that's what Democrats often do.
Yeah.
The let's just say the paramilitaries and folks that were going to take on the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban exiles and the other sorts of paramilitary folks that the CIA was training in different areas, they would have known who would have been the guy that would have done an overt invasion of the Bay of Pigs instead of just the covert one. There's a lot of issue with the Bay of Pigs where the CIA and Nixon, they're planning it as if like, okay, we'll try to do this covertly with this sort of like this flotilla or whatever, this small group that will land on the beach.
It's
but
a
then
COINTELPRO type situation.
But then when
never mind, keep going.
Yeah, but when that doesn't work, we'll have to just call in the American military and we'll just invade Cuba that way.
Gotcha.
So that, and Kennedy was saying, I'm not doing that. And he didn't. And that's probably the best thing the Kennedys ever did. I mean, missile crisis is another thing also, but like, what you have to realize is that Kennedy and the Kennedys were anti-communists. They weren't anti-communist enough for people who wanted to have the confrontation with communism. And so what happens after JFK is assassinated? Like we did start sending like CIA people to Vietnam and stuff before that, but JFK, the Kennedys would not have had the appetite that LBJ and Nixon did for Vietnam, for instance, right? Like, so that's it. It's JFK was more open. You heard Morley talk about that message that Kennedy sent to the Russians, or Jackie Kennedy sent to the Russians, saying, "We don't believe you." We think it was his domestic enemies. Right. That she would send that kind of message to, and that they would have open diplomatic relationship with Russia at this time,
and that she would do it. I mean, or that she would take it upon herself to do such a thing outside of official channels? Yes,
and they had Anatoly Dobrynin was the Soviet ambassador at the time, and there was a whole bunch of outside the channels because the channels were corrupted by these anti-communist freaks, right? And again, like the Kennedys, I grant that they authorized a whole bunch of covert assassination attempts. But when they wouldn't play ball to the extent that these people wanted them to, that's what happened with. I think that they took out Kennedy and LBJ got. And I agree with. I would recommend this. This was just a few days. Jefferson Morley on C-SPAN. He goes into a lot of these things like, did LBJ know? And I think I agree with Morley. Like, there's no evidence to say that LBJ knew beforehand. But once it happened, I think it's very clear that he knew what happened because they had agreed on what the cover story. They were shortly after agreed on what the cover story needed to be.
Well, I mean, how was Vietnam playing into this as well?
Vietnam was still wasn't on it really ramps up after this.
Yes.
I mean, my recollection is that even under Eisenhower and Nixon, there was already like CIA stuff there, and then it did also ramp up under the Kennedys. Like that, and so there are two recommendations I would go that answered these questions a little bit more in depth. Matt Christman was on the Sit Down with Mike Racine's podcast. It must have been like 2 years ago now talking about this. And I like Matt Christman's view on this because I think it is really difficult to be definite about what happened, except that there are so many questions and the official story is a lie. And that we tolerate that is, I think, a sign of like a a willingness to want a bedtime story instead of, especially in the part of the media, instead of actually confronting these inconsistencies.
Or understanding how the intelligence community was willing to likely go this far for somebody who was just lukewarm on the kinds of activities that they wanted to participate in, or, you know, wasn't a full believer in anti-communism militarism.
Yeah, and there's a speech that at the American University speech that the JFK, the more pro-JFK folks believe was a signal that he wasn't going to fight the Cold War to the degree that they wanted him to, and that he was looking, and also it's not just Russia, it's also African nationalist movements. That Lumumba was assassinated apparently with CIA help, and Kennedy was supposedly not thrilled about that. There's a famous picture about that, and so I would also recommend Death is Just Around the Corner. It's a podcast, has like a 4 or 5 part series on the Kennedy assassination, going into what I think, you know, I said the thing about the Chrisman, he doesn't get into super much about the specifics because I think it's hard to really know a lot because, again, you're dealing with spies. But I think if there is a narrative to be told, I think it is like the one on the Death is Just Around the Corner podcast. So I would direct people there.
Awesome stuff. Thank you, Matt.
Oh, and while I'm up here, the Rogel Aguilera Maderos, it looks like that prosecutor, and we'll look at this.
Oh,
maybe,
right, from yesterday.
Yeah, look this up from, see how this develops over the next couple of weeks. But it looks like they're looking back into that 110-year sentence, which everyone knows is appalling. And apparently there's some special break in case of emergency, mandatory minimums workaround that hopefully that they can get that into some kind of proportion. I mean, you know, we'll see what happens there.